Paul Robert Schneider was the first Protestant minister killed in a Nazi prison. He wasn't famous. He wasn't an academic. He wasn't political. His crime was to insist upon the uniqueness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's so hard to put ourselves back in that historical moment when Nazi ideology and cruelty actually required supernatural justification. And so in ways that don't even make sense to us anymore, the Nazi machine required that followers believe that the author of the Nazi flag anthem, Horst Wessel, had not died, but had in fact been resurrected and joined an eternal storm troop in the sky where those faithful to Hitler would one day join him. And so it so happened that Paul Robert Schneider, a pastor in a small village in Germany, in a small nondescript church, would have a young 17-year-old in his church, a young man who had been a member of Hitler's Nazi brigade, die. And at the funeral for this young man, it was conducted by Pastor Schneider like any other funeral, but right before the benediction, the local Nazi leader stood and said, "This young man has already risen in spirit to join Horst Wessel and the eternal storm troop on high." And it was at that moment that Paul Schneider, the pastor, said, "I protest. This is the Church of Jesus Christ for the pure teaching of the Holy Scriptures, and no one will rival the risen Lord Jesus here." And for that reason, Paul Robert Schneider was put in prison. He would preach to other prisoners during the day. And for that reason, he was put into solitary confinement. But even as the roll was called in the mornings, he would shout the gospel to his fellow prisoners, also in solitary confinement, so they could hear him speak of the resurrection of the Lord again every day. So the Nazis tried to silence him, first with humiliation, and then with intimidation, and then with torture, and he would not be silent. Even his fellow prisoners said, "Why do you keep on preaching?" And he said, "Someone has to preach in this hell." Until they gave him the lethal injection where he could preach no more. And we would say, well, that ends the story, I suppose. A good man believed the truth, and one day he will rise again. But it was not actually the message that he wanted us to hear, not in its entirety. He actually wrote to his children, 6 of them, from prison. And the words that he wrote were these: "Christ may not be seen in every deed, but he is present in every hour because he is the risen Lord. He is with us now." It was a simple theme to which we are consistently needing reminder. That the truth of the resurrection is not just about an end-of-life consequence. It is about daily significance. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life," by which he is not just talking about his destiny, he is talking about his identity. So that if we are united to him, the reality of the resurrection is not something off out there somewhere. It is the source of courage and power and hope this day to do what God calls us to do in hard places and difficult times, when hope seems lost, when evil seems strong. We believe in the one who is the resurrection. And the way in which that gives us power and hope is because it's actually answering the very basic questions of our lives. What difference does it make that Jesus is the resurrection? Among other things, it's answering the very basic question, can he help us? Can he help? And the answer is yes, because he is proven by the resurrection to be our God. I mean, the divine recognition is certainly in this passage. You know what Martha says in verse 27. When Jesus asks about her belief, she finally says the words, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world, into our reality. But of course, it's not just verbal affirmation. We don't just have divine recognition. We have the expression of divine power. I mean, it's just so simple, right? It's verses 43 and 44. Lazarus, come out. And he does. And in ways that I suppose are a little bit gory and odd, we're to understand that that's to be an unmistakable display of the power of divinity. After all, Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days. Lord, don't take the stone away. He'll stink. He is really, truly dead. No mistaking that. And the fact that he rises from the dead is to say that Jesus has the power over death. He is divine. And it's not just divine power. Many have written it's actually divine prudence. He says, Lazarus, come forth. And many have written, if he was not specific that it was Lazarus, everybody would have come out of the grave. Right? He had power to do that. And in fact, that will occur. Because you may recall the time will come when he will appear with the trumpet call of God and the shout of the archangel. And what will happen? The dead in Christ will rise. Because he will say, all who are mine, come forth. He has that kind of power with that kind of discretion. And it's not just power that's on display here. It's incredible knowledge that is divine as well. We know the account, some of us, so well that we don't notice the details that are so special. That there is foreknowledge, divine knowledge on display. In verse 4, do you remember what is said? Jesus, your friend is sick. This illness will not lead to death. He's already saying what will happen before it has happened. Verse 23, your brother will rise again. As what we are having demonstrated in the person of Christ is that reality of the divine knowledge of time that God himself has, where we have space that we fold out before us on a map so that we see all of geography spread out. To God, that is time itself, unrolled before him as a map so that he knows the end from the beginning. And when the message comes that Lazarus is sick, he already tells us the end of the story. This will not lead to death. He has divine foreknowledge, and it's full knowledge. So that when the message comes that Lazarus is sick, he not only announces that it's not unto death, but then without any sort of text message, with no email, he will later say to his disciples, what? Lazarus has fallen asleep. No one has brought that message, so the disciples actually don't understand what he's saying. So he tells them clearly in verses 14 and 15, Lazarus has died. It's not just foreknowledge. It is full knowledge of events. And it's not just, we see it in the nearness of what Christ is saying about Lazarus himself in this moment. Some of you may recall that this is not the first time we have heard the name Lazarus in the Gospels. Weeks before this, Jesus has told an account. Some say a true account, some say a parable, but he has told an account of two persons. One, a rich man. And the rich man has a beggar at his gate that he doesn't care for. But the rich man dies. And the consequence of his lack of mercy and lack of trust in God is we are told that he goes to hell. And in his misery, he speaks to that representation of God, to Father Abraham in heaven. And he sees that the beggar who's been at his gate is in the bosom, in the care of Father Abraham. And so the rich man, suffering in hell, says to Abraham, would you please send the beggar at my gate back to tell my brothers what I'm experiencing, and then they will believe. And do you remember what Abraham says? They have Moses and the prophets. If they did not believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if someone rises from the dead. Now, Jesus has told this account weeks earlier. Tell me the name of the poor beggar. His name was Lazarus. And now, weeks later, this same Jesus heals, resuscitates, raises from the dead a man named Lazarus. And now all the Jewish people and leaders believe, right? No, what happened as a consequence of Lazarus rising from the dead? They sought him all the more, including Caiaphas, the high priest, remember, who says, now Jesus really has to die because it's better that one man die for whom? For the whole nation, than that everybody believe this stuff. Not recognizing he was actually prophesying what Jesus had known all along. Not just that Lazarus' resurrection would not convince these leaders, but that his own resurrection would be necessary in order for the world to be saved and the nation to actually fulfill the prophecy of Caiaphas. It's amazing. Jesus is demonstrating that he is actually God in power, in knowledge. And we love that. That this one that we worship, that this one that we regard so highly has the power to help us. Except that's not our final question. If he can help us, our real question is, does he care to do so? Does he care? And the answer to that question is also because Jesus is the resurrection, proving to us that he not merely has the nature of God, but has the heart of a man. That heart is on display for us over and over again. The evidence of his care is first that he enters into our reality. Remember what Martha says, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, coming into the world. That he would take flesh. That he would come in the humility of being the creator God, the one who is above all things, and would come and live in humility and under the law and in poverty, and would take on all those indications of our humanity. And not only take on flesh, but he would actually limit his divinity. We need the details. Did you ever think how strange verse 34 is? Just look there a moment. Now, Jesus, remember, has already talked about someone named Lazarus weeks ahead of time who's going to die. He's already told his disciples that the death will not be a final death. He's at some distance away in another town, understood the moment at which Lazarus dies. He's indicated amazing divine knowledge. And then he actually gets to the town and he says, "Where have you laid him?" Well, no, wait a second. What's he doing? But actually expressing to us the willingness to take on flesh with its limitations in ways that sometimes astound us. In ways that I confess at times are even a little bit humorous. Verse 41. Do you remember? They took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." And then we get this a little aside. "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around." I don't have to do this out loud. I don't actually have to pray to you. I am one with you. But for the sake of other people, so that they will understand how great is my care for them because you have sent me to them, I'm actually going to pray to you in their hearing. But all these limitations upon his divinity that are expressions of his humanity are not ultimately why we know he cares. Does he care? Verse 35. The verse we most like memorizing. Jesus wept. Does he care? I know he has power. Does he care? Jesus wept. Perhaps even more significant are the words that escape us with what he did as well. Because what we see here are not only his tears, but perhaps even better expression of his care, his anger. Verse 33. When Jesus saw Lazarus' sister weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, when we read the deeply moved in our English translations, our tendency is just to think of sympathetic grief, empathy. He's torn up inside. It's not that there's no meaning to that. But would it help you to understand that the actual root of this phrase, deeply moved, is the snorting of a horse? The more common expression here is of indignation. It is of outrage. What Jesus is perceiving is that this sister of Lazarus is grieving and wondering where he's been. And you get maybe a sense of that more in verse 38 where the phrase appears again. Jesus then, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. But why is he deeply moved again? You have to go back into verse 37. Some of the Jews said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" And Jesus was he was indignant again. First because of the sisters' hurt, and then because of the Jews' disbelief. That something in him is reacting not just in tears, but in outrage. And we say, well, no, that's not right. That's Jesus. He's not supposed to get mad, but there are just things to get angry at, and among them is death and pain in this world. The great intruders, the disruption of the good creation, so that even Christ, and you have to realize this, he knows that Lazarus is going to rise again. So what's he upset about? Because he is perceiving the reality of sin's corruption and harm and what it is doing, not just to the physical reality of Lazarus, but to the hearts and the doubts and the disbelief of other people, because they are not understanding how important is his own resurrection to them. They have not perceived the reality of how great is the harm, no, how great is his help. And so he expresses grief, but at the same moment, right with it, is this indignation, this anger. And dare I say it, we need to know that. To know that he really, really cares. I have a friend, one of my former students, who's now a colleague in ministry. And he writes about what the anger of Jesus means to him. He says, when my daughter was diagnosed with cancer, I read many books and articles on suffering and dealing with tragedy. I was generally left feeling that the authors didn't really understand what I was going through. They all quoted the Bible a lot. But I have a theology degree, and I've read the Bible cover to cover. I already know that God loved me. I know that he provides for the sparrow. I know that Jesus wept over the death of his friend Lazarus. I knew that God wins in the end. But I also know that my kid had cancer and was dying. And I felt so gravely alone and could not figure out how I was supposed to walk this road. And then some guy on the radio provided the missing piece. He said, there is not a good way of going through something like this. Because as a human being, I was not built for this. This is not the way the good world that God created is supposed to function. Cancer in children is a foreign invader which can never be reconciled as members of God's good creation to our hearts, and should not be. It would be like getting a handful of sand in your eye and saying, it's okay. That makes no sense. Nothing will be as it's supposed to be until you can get it out. And I am no more built for watching my 5-year-old die of leukemia than my eyes are designed for sand. Suddenly I knew something more than, hold on, Jesus wins in the end. He came not just so that you and I can go to heaven one day. He came because this world is broken and needs to be fixed, and people need to believe that the world is really broken and really needs to be fixed. His incarnation and his resurrection hit the pavement on my street where I live like it never had before. I knew it might not mean that my daughter would survive. But it did mean that my deep sadness was valid, and I was not alone. I knew not only that Jesus was weeping with me, I knew that he felt the same rage toward the suffering that I feel. Does Jesus care? He wept, yes. And then he snorted in indignation at the wrong that has corrupted the creation that he made good, so that we would recognize how great is the correction, how necessary is what he must do to be the victor over the wrong. We don't just roll over and say, oh, it will be all right. We say it is wrong. And that is why he must rise the victor over it. So if we answer the questions, can he help? And the answer to that is yes, he can, because he is divine. And then the question is, does he care? And the answer to that is yes, because he shares our human feelings and human heart. He can be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. Our next question is, what's going to motivate him? I mean, if he can help and he does care, what now are the motivations of God to act in the ways that are right and good and appropriate for the brokenness and the difficulties that we face? And the answers are actually stated here. It occurred early in the chapter. In verse 4 was the first statement of it. What does actually motivate the one who cares to exercise his power in ways that are prudent and powerful and right? Jesus said of Lazarus, this illness does not lead to death. It is for what? It is for the glory of God. I mean, we have heard this sort of thing said before. There was the time that a man born blind was presented to Jesus. And even Jesus' disciples asked him, do you remember? Jesus, who sinned that this man was born blind? Who sinned? Did he sin? Or did his what? Did his parents sin? And Jesus said what? Neither. This is so that the glory of God may be revealed in him. What motivates Jesus? The glory of God. And in order for the glory of God to be revealed, there are not always just simple, easy, make sense to me now answers. There are strange things that happen here. Remember, the message comes to Jesus, your friend is sick in another town. And Jesus immediately gets in the ambulance and goes to the other town. Is that what happens? No, what does he do? He waits what? He waits 2 days before even starting out. No, Lord, listen, you have to act faster. You need to act now. And even when he gets there, it's against human expectation. Both sisters, who profoundly love and believe Jesus, say to him, if you had come here earlier, this horrible thing would not have happened. He would not have died. Sometimes people don't know what to make of it, and so they follow Jesus just almost fatalistically. That's what Thomas does in this same passage. You may remember when Jesus says he's going to go to Jerusalem, already the disciples know that the Jewish leaders are waiting to arrest and to kill him at Jerusalem. And when Jesus says he is going to help Lazarus and the family, Thomas says, well, let's just go and die with him. It's hopeless. But Jesus is working with divine knowledge and power in ways that are exceeding our timing and our logic and our expectation, and we don't always like that. I have 4 children. 3 are married. Every single one of them have struggled with infertility and disease. Every single one of my married children. People ask me at my age, with my kids married for a decade and more, well, how many grandkids do you have? Well, I'm kind of like Abraham. I don't have any. And it's not my suffering that's the greatest. It's my children and their spouses, and they wonder, what's the timing about? What's the logic? Can he help? Yes. Does he care? Yes. What will motivate him? His own glory. Now, you must know that when we talk about God being motivated by his own glory, that's the stuff that preachers are supposed to say. Why does God do what he does? For his own glory. All right, let's have the benediction. No, You don't understand. I mean, if I'm just honest with you, when you tell me that God is doing things for His own glory and I'm struggling and I'm hurting, it sounds terribly egotistical. Okay, I'll straighten it up in a minute. But anyway, it sounds. He does it for His own glory. Why does God do things for His own glory? Why does He need glory? Because He says, whoever believes in me will have eternal life. A man, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. That there's an ultimacy that is not in this world. That there is a way things are made right that is not going to happen in the brokenness of this creation. And the reason we put the lights on the exit signs, and the reason we paint the life preservers orange, and the reason that we put the fire extinguishers red is we want attention on what can save eternally. We want attention for what gives life. And so Jesus is saying to us, listen, I need people who hope in me when it seems totally hopeless. Who recognize that there is an ultimacy beyond this world. Who recognize that I can take risk, that I can have hope, that I will take courage, that I will do what God calls me to do because He is the resurrection and the life. That His identity is my own, which means that my destiny is not fulfilled in this life alone. And what I am being called to do by faith, and sometimes by suffering, and sometimes through hope in the midst of it, is give Him glory. Because that is what He is calling me to do. Because His motivation is not simply His glory. It is our good. Why do we light the exit sign? Why do we paint the extinguisher red? Because we want people to be able to find what they need. It is for their good. And Jesus is telling you and He is telling me that the ultimacies of eternity that are being answered by the fact that we're united to the one who is the resurrection, that becomes our hope beyond this world that is so broken that even He has a rage about it. But more than that, He has sent a rescuer into it. So that what troubles us is being answered ultimately by the one who is the resurrection and the life. And so that we will believe in Him. He conducts what is necessary in our lives and our world so that the glory goes to Him because our good requires it. This isn't always easy. But the reason you, pastors and church leaders, are serving some of you in hard situations year after year, where people think you are foolish, where perhaps your own parents think you are wrong, where your spouse may wonder when things are going to turn around, is you are actually believing that your life is hooked to an eternal purpose because you are united to the resurrection. You are united to Christ. And so what you are doing is of eternal significance when it makes no sense at all. And you are willing to live for His glory because you know ultimately it is for your eternal good and the eternal good of all those who witness His glory through you. Who believe that He is the resurrection and the life. I haven't heard it expressed better than through a marvelous young couple who serve in the inner city of Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. Some of you may know the work of Maria Garriott, who has written 1,000 resurrections. And what has sustained her and her husband through 30 years and 5 kids in the inner city of Baltimore. She writes, I did not know that we would scrape by just above the poverty line for years. That I would live with people who heard voices or had spent most of their lives in juvenile hall or in prison. That I would share a house with women who sold their bodies, snorted cocaine, or whose boyfriends choked and punched them. I did not know when we began this ministry that my children would be lead poisoned. that their friend who ate at our table like a godson would not go to college with them, but to prison. That a little boy with no daddy at home who had baked cookies in my kitchen and hunted snakes with my son would one day lie on the street in a pool of blood. I did not know that several times a week for years, my husband would wake in the night agonizing over whether we were going to be able to reach this neighborhood at all. I did not know that when I was scraped raw, that Jesus would heal me. That when I was broken, God would use my brokenness, and that life could spring up in hope again, where it seemed that dying and evil had gained the upper hand. I did not know that I would witness 1,000 resurrections. That the church members who struggled to pay the rent would adopt nieces and nephews to save them from drug-addicted parents. That a woman in our church who saw a teenaged mother roll a baby stroller into an empty house and abandon it there would herself then raise that baby as her own and give that child hope and life. I did not know that men who snorted cocaine could get clean and love Jesus. That women sexually abused by their fathers could be healed and then could actually rescue other children and give them hope of life. I did not know that Muslims from Iraq and atheists from China and Hindus from India would find Jesus and would actually fill me with faith. I did not know that they would become my heroes and friends. I did not know that they would be braided into my heart and that I would know the resurrection through the resurrection of Christ in them. I have seen 1,000 resurrections. Why? Because those in whom Christ works are united to the resurrection and the life. And the ultimacies of this immediate experience are not the final picture. She writes over and over again, I didn't know. But what she is saying is what we should know and what she would now affirm. That because Jesus is the resurrection and the life, we exist in places where hope seems to be gone. And we give our lives where it seems to be wrong. And when the wrong seems to have had the upper hand, we can exist with courage and take risks and live for others and have hope still. Why? Because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And whosoever believes in him, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in him shall never die. Do you believe that? Then live the life of those in whom the resurrected Lord now lives. It is not just an end-of-life consequence. It is the daily truth that gives us life and strength and courage and hope. Because my Lord is the resurrection and my life.